Peter Fleischer. I work for, as Shora so nicely put it, I work for the Google Candy Store. And I want to say, Shora, yeah, keep on investigating Microsoft. That's great. So I had a presentation to talk about compliance, GDPR, machine learning. We may get to all that, but there are no slides. I've decided to throw that all away and try to speak spontaneously because there's breaking news. And the breaking news will come tomorrow out of Luxembourg. So raise your hand if you're interested in privacy. And raise the other hand if you're interested in freedom of expression. And which hand's more important? Well, that's the decision tomorrow. Luxembourg is the home, as you know, of Europe's top court. And tomorrow, at 10 a.m., they will issue a decision in two separate Google cases that came out of originally the Costeca Google Right to be Forgotten cases that will probably be two of the most important cases of my legal career, and they go far beyond just the right to be forgotten. And I want to get a little bit of the context and the history of these cases, why they're important, what we believe at Google, what's likely to happen tomorrow, and what the consequences may be for all of us. So just a little bit of history. You remember in 2014, the same European Court of Justice created this right to be forgotten. It was a judicially created right. It came out of a Google Spain case against a gentleman named Mr. Costeja. Mr. Costeja had failed to pay his taxes in Spain many years ago, and a Spanish newspaper reported the fact that he had failed to pay his taxes. And it was published in the official journal of Spain, as is required under Spanish law. So some years later went by, and he was upset when people would do a search on his name in Google, that one of the search results they would see were links to this newspaper article. So he came to Google and said, take them down. Don't show those when people search on my name. And we said, but that's valid legal content. It's true. He didn't dispute. It clearly was true. It's protected by journalism, et cetera, et cetera. So he went to the Spanish DPA. And the Spanish DPA said, the journalistic content is protected, but the search results should not be shown. And I said, well, that's ridiculous. I mean, if the content is legal and it's journalism, surely people can use search to find it. You can't have one standard for lawful content in journalism and another for search. They said, yes, you can. I said, well, we'll go to court. So we went to Spanish court. Spanish court said, well, that looks like a big question. We're going to send it to the European Court of Justice. And I was absolutely convinced that we would be right. I was 100% convinced of this. The Advocate General agreed with us. And you know, when you get the Advocate General to agree with you, your confidence rises even more. But in 2014, I was proven completely wrong. The European Court of Justice ruled exactly that we would have to, as Google and other search engines, do an assessment when people would come to us. And they would say, please remove a link to a search result when someone searches on my name if my privacy rights are not outweighed by the public's right to continue to access that lawful information. In other words, a balance test, if you will. And I thought, well, boy, how are we going to do that? I mean, that's a new law. We had no idea what the scale would be. We had no idea what it would look like. But we built a compliance program to try to do this. We now have 5 years of experience with this. So I can tell you what it is and what it has become. We've done this 3.3 million times across Europe. This is not done by machines. This is done by people in our legal team, myself and many of my colleagues. And we are acting a little bit like mini judges, because what are we asked to do? We are asked to assess a person's right to privacy on the one hand, and balance it against the public's right to continue to access that information. So it really is a privacy versus access to information kind of balance test. And when you've done something 3.3 million times, you've seen just about every possible scenario that you can imagine in the human condition. I know a lot about the sorts of things people want to have hidden. I also make a lot of friends, as you can imagine, 46% about, and the others not so happy. A couple of the people who were not so happy filed appeals and went to DPAs, as they're supposed to do. And what happened? Well, one of the DPAs went to the French Data Protection Authority, the CNIL, and the CNIL took a look at all of this. And the CNIL said, you know, Google and other search engines, when you do a delisting, if someone is really supposed to get a right to be forgotten, that delisting should be global, not just in Europe. Well, the original Costeja decision of the European Court of Justice didn't address the geographic scope. It just didn't talk about it. I obviously had to build a program to implement it starting day one. You can't wait for additional judicial guidance. We had to start doing something. So we took what I thought was a very reasonable position, that it was a decision of Europe's top court, applying European privacy law, the directive at the time, the GDPR now, in an area where this right to be forgotten did not exist in other countries around the world. In fact, it had been explicitly rejected by many countries around the world as unconstitutional under various constitutions around the world, the United States, Chile, Colombia, and so on. So we've been doing this in Europe, but not beyond, for the last 5 years. The CNIL said you have to do this globally. We said no. So that's the question that's going to the European Court of Justice. And the question is really quite stark. It isn't really whether we will do delistings for right to be forgotten in Europe only or beyond. It's really, can one country or one region, Europe in this case, actually pass a law that says we want a particular type of content removed, not just in our borders, but worldwide. And think about it, one of the reasons I've been fighting this on principle so hard, and why I hope I will win tomorrow, is because imagine what a judicial precedent would mean for countries around the world, in particular authoritarian, non-democratic regimes around the world, who would say, there are certain forms of content that I want removed in my country, and I will now cite European precedent and demand that Google and others remove this globally. I mean, it's not an exaggeration to say, in a world like that, freedom of expression on the internet goes to the lowest common denominator of what any country would say, that's okay for me. It really would. So the scale and scope of geographic delisting goes far beyond the right to be forgotten. It really goes to who's in charge, who gets to make the rules, and what is the geographic scope of the rules that I get to make. The second question, and it's a completely unrelated case, but it also came out of France, and will also be announced tomorrow, is what about sensitive personal data in the context of the right to be forgotten? And there, too, it goes well beyond the narrow questions being asked. So there are some plaintiffs, and these were 5 individual unrelated cases that came out of France. One about a gentleman's association with the Scientology church, another about a politician and an affair with another politician, and so on. You know, the kinds of cases that implicate sensitive personal data under the GDPR. And the question is, well, should the right to be forgotten, delistings if you will, be automatic in cases where we're talking about sensitive personal data? If you read the GDPR and the provision on sensitive personal data, it kind of looks like you need explicit consent to process it, right? Except that that makes absolutely no sense in the context of a search engine. We couldn't possibly know either what sensitive personal data is, certainly couldn't have consent from data subjects. So the question would be, well, if there is an automatic right to delistings, what happens to freedom of expression on the internet? That would literally mean that any politician, any public figure could essentially have any content removed as soon as that content is talking about sensitive personal data, such as their health status or sex scandals or lots of other categories. So we've been advocating for the position that, and I hope the court will follow it, there still has to be a balance test, even in the context of sensitive personal data. There still has to be a balance test between, on the one hand, privacy, and there may be more privacy, if you will, when it's about sensitive personal data, and the public's right to access the information on the other. We have been applying that balance test for the last 5 years, and in this case, unlike the other one, the CNIL agrees with us. The CNIL and Google are on the same side of this debate. The Advocate General in both of these cases largely agreed with the positions that we're advocating going into this decision tomorrow. So we'll see what happens. But I think the consequences of this will be very important. If the positions that we are advocating are upheld tomorrow, that is, in a sense, a status quo. That's the way the world has been working. If they don't, then it's not the status quo. There are some big changes, and we'd have to think hard about what those big changes would mean. So that's the breaking news, and I wanted to interrupt on the breaking news before resuming our regular programming. All right. If this conversation had been 24 hours later, it would be a very different conversation. So you've gotten the heads up, not the post-facto analysis, but stay tuned. Little aside, the really interesting article this morning, something I talked to a journalist in the New York Times on this topic. If you'd like to read something, literally out today, it's online. And talks about the extensions of the right to be forgotten in unpredictable ways in Italy and beyond. So privacy compliance. A few words about what we're doing at Google for the GDPR. I've known some people in the room for very many years. I was the first full-time privacy professional at Google, in that wonderful privacy department that I know many of you are in, being one of one. And like the one of one, I got to do absolutely everything in the field of privacy, from the philosophically inspiring to the completely banal fix the photocopy machine and all of that. We are now 400 people at Google who work full-time in the field of privacy, 400, which is astounding. We put in 500 human hours of work getting ready for the GDPR in the run-up to May 18 months ago. 500 human years of work. And let me give you a few statistics about some of the stuff that we've been doing in this space. We all, like you, are working on accountability and compliance programs and all the things that we're obligated to do under the GDPR and other things. But as a tech company, I think our bigger obligation is to actually work in the tech field to develop the kinds of tools that allow people to control their own data. I mean, the GDPR has a lot of provisions in there that really are essentially about data management. When you think about things like data portability, for example, the ability of people to make their own decisions about whether a controller is enabled to continue to process their data for whatever purpose. I mean, those are data management tools. And the majority of the 400 people I mentioned who work in the field of privacy are actually engineers who are building the tools to allow people to use them. I work with some of them conceptually, like what would a good tool look like? What would be useful in terms of privacy compliance, both for us and for people who use our tools? But they actually build it. And when you build something on the internet, you never really know, are people going to use it? Is it going to be popular? Is it going to live up to people's expectations? And like everything, you never just do it once and you're done. You start a process and you iterate, and hopefully you get better and you improve things as you go along. And that's what we've been doing in these data management tools. If you think about Google Account, that's where you can essentially go into your own account, your own data, and as a user of any Google services that are authenticated, you can essentially set all of your privacy settings. So how many people are using that? Because that, to me, is the test of whether this is working or not. In the last full year, we had over 2 billion people, worldwide using those tools, which is an astounding, and a couple other statistics. Over half the people who go in to use those tools actually change default settings about the default privacy settings, which itself is also fascinating. A lot of people think defaults never get changed. Well, they never get changed if you make it too hard for people to change them. Another interesting fact, over half the people who are engaging with that are doing it through the mobile format rather than desktops, which is also fascinating, at least to me it is. So that tells me a number of things. It tells me that if you build tools that are simple and easy to use and do things that people want to do, people will use them. I mean, this is not an obscure series of tools for data protection professionals like those of us in the room, but this is stuff that actually responds to a desire that people have to take back control of their own data. The work in this field continues, and I think there's going to be a lot more interesting innovations in the years ahead. But let me just talk a few minutes about machine learning. The reason I do this job and what gets me out of bed every morning isn't really devising an accountability framework for the GDPR for this. It is thinking about what are we doing today that will impact what the world looks like 10 years from now. And I think the world will look very different, and therefore the responsibility of getting it right today is very great. And why do I think so? Well, first of all, we all know there's Moore's law about computers doubling in their power 18 months or so, right? We've all grown up on that. And that logarithmic growth is pretty astounding. That by itself means that in 30 jumps, you've gone to something 1 million times more powerful. Well, 30 jumps of 18 months, that's a life, this is within human life frames. So we'll be dealing with something a million times more powerful. I can imagine what computing looks like 10 times more powerful. I cannot imagine what you do with it when it's a million times more powerful. But wait, it's not just that. We are on the cusp of the quantum revolution. The quantum revolution, according to experts, is expected not to double in power exponentially, the way Moore's law has. Get this, it's supposed to increase at double exponential rates. Now, some of you may think, I don't even know what that means. I'm not a mathematician, I don't know what that, but that's fast. I mean, we are talking about things that go like that, right? They just change so fast. The changes at the beginning are incremental and small. But once they accelerate, double exponential means it's a rate of change that we as humans are simply not programmed to really understand, with the implications of what that means for us all. So as we think about machine learning, we are experimenting with some techniques that improve privacy today. And I want to just mention a few of them. Well, one of them is what we call differential privacy. That's essentially mathematical models that you can use to kind of create noise, basically. You try to essentially disrupt a certain predictability while retaining what you really want to be able to analyze and understand from. That's a technique that we've put out in many different forms. We've open sourced something in differential privacy just last week. If you're interested, look up the Google blog from last week. We've been working on stuff that is on-device processing. So rather than being sucked up into the cloud where everything is done centrally, a lot of the processing can happen on-device. And one form of that is what we call federated learning, where you want to learn from a bunch of different machines doing something and aggregate the learnings into one central space. You don't have to do it all on a central server. Let me give you an example. If you're using spell check, or the ability of machines to essentially learn how to spell words or understand words, or do translation from language to language, or anything, or understand human language, you can build models where all of that happens on a mobile device, where the mobile device learns to improve the algorithm. It says, aha, I've just learned something that would be more reliable on my device here, and all it does is it shares the learning up centrally. It doesn't share everything that happened on the device locally. It just shares the eureka little moment. And each little eureka moment might be tiny by itself, like how do you pronounce the name Shura? But if you put it all together, suddenly you can build these models where machines learn human language, where machines learn to speak every language known to mankind, where they can translate between every language known to mankind. And again, think about mathematically. Translating from language to language, we are talking about, way over 10,000 language pairs. There are no human beings who can do anything remotely like that. It's every possible paradigm of language to language. And so when we think about machine learning, we're thinking about models where you can get the full benefit of the machine learning experience while still having these privacy paradigms to protect what is happening on my individual device as an individual human being, contributing, if you will, to the greater science and to the greater knowledge of how all of this works, without having everything that I do become part of a giant data pool. A couple words about the status of machine learning at Google in terms of its applications today. I'm not talking about science fiction, stuff today. We now have models that, get this, from photographs, can diagnose 26 different skin conditions at greater than human expert dermatologists. That's astounding. That's absolutely astounding. Similarly, they can look at models of tissues from biopsies comparing healthy tissues to cancerous tissues in a whole range of different kinds of cancerous formats. Again, it's not just that the machines are good at pattern recognition and doing this sort of thing, which they are, and they're not replacing doctors, they're performing a particular task to assist doctors, obviously. But it's a breakthrough not just in knowledge and getting this right, it's also a breakthrough in cost. Essentially, once the algorithm is there, it doesn't actually even cost anything to use it, right? I mean, a machine looking at a cancerous biopsy of breast cancer and saying that's pathological tissue compared to healthy tissue, from a machine point of view, is not more or less expensive than something that is doing a Swedish to English translation text. Right? It actually doesn't matter. It's just a data format. So when I think about what's happening in this space, I think it's incredibly impressive about the benefits of machine learning. But I'm not a tech utopian, and I don't think anybody in this room are tech utopians, because most of us are professionally here because we think about what can go wrong and the issues to watch out about. And so while I'm convinced that these are the most powerful tools that we'll ever create, and they will become more powerful, like every tool, a powerful tool can be used for good and can be used for bad. And the more powerful the tools are, the more bad they can be used for. So a couple things that are happening around the corner that will have severe implications, I think, for potential misuse. You've all heard of the concept of deep fakes, I'm sure. Well, we're now talking about machine learning algorithms that can create images of a human being, either a real human being or a completely synthetic human being, that can create voices and can completely mimic the voice of a particular real human being or create an entirely synthetic human being, and can do the same thing in a video format. So we're talking about the ability to create videos or photos of humans speaking in a voice that mimics a real human being's, saying things that that person never said. Now, does that sound like something that could be misused to undermine our democracies? For example, that's our panel next, so maybe we can come to that. It can also be incredibly cool. We've taught machines, get this, not just to understand human language in every language spoken on the planet, and some languages better than others, but still, an amazing feat for those of us who've been watching how computers have struggled with human language. But we can also teach machines to understand human pathological speech. You know, people who just have speech impairments or speech pathologies or speech paralyses. Those of us in this room would have trouble understanding as human beings, but the machines don't care. The machines just understand a pattern, and they understand what this person is trying to say. So it's, again, a very powerful tool for human good. But when you think about fake news today, well, I think that's a joke compared to the issue of fake news that we as societies will be facing around the corner. I mean, fake news today basically is just news that we know is already fake. You're just suspending disbelief, choosing not to believe it. That's pretty much what fake news is today. But fake news around the corner is something that humans can no longer tell from the real thing. And there the question is going to become, and we'll come back to the issues of like what can Google and other companies do about this. If humans can no longer tell the difference, well then isn't it our obligation to try to teach the machines that learned how to create the fakes to spot the fake and warn the human that this is a fake? As long as the machine is not faking the human. Right? So, you know, let's put it this way. I don't think my job and I don't think your jobs are done. When I look at this, I think, gee, the last 25 years that I've been in the privacy profession, while they were always fascinating and interesting and challenging and all of that, I think in a couple years when I look back at them, those will have been the salad days, when issues were simple and easy and we could worry about street view photos, and we could worry about, you know, whether the ad profile was an opt-in or an opt-out, and the issues that people get very excited about today. But in the future, I think it's going to be vastly more challenging and also vastly more important that the work that we do in this room and as this profession works for the benefit of our entire societies. That's why I'm in it for the next quarter century, and I hope you are too. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. I believe we might have a question or two. I'm a bit hesitant to use the catch boxes, but they are, okay. Calle's walking around with one, and Cecilia has the other one. Do we have a question for Peter?
Hello.
Yeah, all right.
Hello.
Yeah, we hear you.
Great. So I'm Sverker from Swedbank, and I want to get to the trivial things. So the work with making platforms for choices and defaults, are amendable. I wonder, how do you reason what should the level of granularity should be? What should be the defaults? How is this discussion going? Personally, I sent a request for you to, where I asked you to stop marketing within the YouTube platform, and I got quite, disappointing response.
So, there's a lot of thought that goes into where do you set the cursor, if you will, in terms of the information that you provide to people and the type of consent that you get for different forms of processing. And we have to get a balance right, because, you know, we could design 10,000 settings. We could throw out 10,000 settings and say, you know, our machines don't care. We'll operate according to 10,000 settings. But who here thinks the average user wants to be faced with 10,000 different privacy settings? So we have to have some form of aggregation and simplification to make this work. That being said, we can also change them over time. And in some cases, I don't think we got them exactly right. I'll give you an example today. We published a blog today where we said, I think we got one of our settings wrong. And what was it specifically? You know, when you use the Google Assistant, you are speaking to a device, like to do a search through a Google Assistant, which means that the computer needs to understand the human language that's being spoken. And the only way you can build programs where the computer can understand human language is that some small percentage of them, less than 1%, is actually listened to by a real human being, disassociated from your name and your account, who then checks the quality of what the machine thinks it understood against what the human heard it to say. In other words, humans listen to a small percentage of these things. And that was in the press in the Netherlands and in a few other places, and people said that's an outrage and blah, blah, blah. It wasn't opt-in, but the opt-in was not as clear as it should have been. It was not as prominent as it should have been. So we launched a new setting on that today and announced it in a blog post today. It's a clear opt-in with clear information about the fact that in a small percentage of cases, an actual real human being is listening to a sample of these things. By the way, that's not just Google. I mean, everybody does the same thing who is in the space of teaching machines to understand human language. That's Alexa, that's Siri, that's Microsoft, the whole gang. Everybody has to do this because that's the only way you can teach machines, right? Supervised learning, if you will. So a lot of thought, but I'm the first one to think, you know, if you don't get it right, fix it. I mean, and there are cases, so.
Yeah. My name is Jonas,
Hey, Jonas.
compliance manager. And I just have a question. If you lose tomorrow, how will this affect, and you know, and the scope, the geographical scope will be global for the right to be forgotten. How will this affect your operations in like the US, where this might be in breach of their laws?
Yeah. Well, you're right that, you know, the United States has rejected the right to be forgotten. You know, First Amendment, freedom of speech. Courts have said that's not possible. One scenario you could easily imagine is that Google or a publisher, let's say the New York Times, could conceivably sue Google and say, Google, you're not allowed to reduce links to my New York Times journalism in the United States searched on by someone in the United States because of a European law that is unconstitutional in the United States, which would put us in that position of nobody wants to be in, which is to be in direct conflict between two completely contradictory sets of rules. So the debate might be finished in Europe, and then might just move to other places and start up all over again.
Thank you so much. This was very interesting.
All right, thanks.